All right, let's talk about how to mix the low end of your song to create clarity. This is admittedly one of the hardest things I think in engineering. I've heard lots of engineers say it took them 5 years plus before they felt like they were getting really good clarity and separation on the low end. But it's critical to nail because it definitely separates a professional sounding mix from an amateur sounding one. If your low end isn't clear, if it's muddy, it's going to make the entire song muddy, and all the high end frequency in the world can't fix it. So I have a song pulled up here with a pretty dense low end, and I wanted to show you my step-by-step process for mixing the low end to make sure that we're getting cohesion and clarity, but we're not losing that heaviness. This is a black metal song with a actually fairly large and round low end, and there's a lot of information down here. So on the one hand, we have, let's see, these are the tremolos. We have rhythm guitar, which is occupying low end frequency information. We have the bass guitar. Here's the rhythm guitar for you. And then we have the pads as well. So we have a sub pad and kind of a mid-level pad, both of which are occupying low end information. Sound like this. Okay. And the drums, of course, with the kick, also occupying low end information. So this is a lot of different things. We have two pads, at least 4 different guitar tracks between the rhythm and the tremolos, the bass track and the kick drum, all fighting for the same range of frequencies. The good news is there is something that we can do about that. So I like to approach it step by step. The first thing that I'm going to do is focus on complementary EQ moves. So I'm going to use Pro Q3 here just so you can see exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to start on the kick. You can see this thing's wonky, kind of all over the place. Let's actually take this back to baseline and play around with it a little bit. So sounds a little floppy. I'm going to boost a lot down here in the sub range to give some girth to it. Let's see, little boxiness I want to get rid of. Generally going to want some click around there. And since this is black metal, I don't think that I necessarily need all of this higher frequency information. Okay, so we have that EQ'd. Now let's just add the bass. I like to start my low end mixes by just focusing on getting the EQ dialed in correctly between the kick drum and the bass guitar. I'm going to go back to clean here. And what's nice about Pro Q3 is it lets you visually see all the other instruments where you have that plugin engaged, so we can see in red what the frequency of the kick drum looks like while I'm in here editing the bass EQ. And what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be looking for complementary EQ moves, meaning if there's an area of the frequency spectrum that the kick drum is really active in, I'm going to dip that area on the bass, and I'm going to boost areas where the kick drum is less active so they can kind of snap together like puzzle pieces. And that's a way that you start to get a glue effect between the kick and the bass. And I'm just going to solo the kick and the bass until I feel like I'm getting that. See, right away I can see that there's a lot of kick where I just boosted in the 50K range, so I might do a high pass filter here to give that low end information on the kick drum all the room it needs. Looks like worth boosting here at 120 where we see the fundamental frequency of the bass. This is probably something I'm going to want to take out. And then I'm going to boost somewhere over here to get the grind on the bass, that high end that's going to let the bass really poke through here. It's usually 800 to 1200 hertz. All right, so what we did here is we made room for the fundamental frequency on the kick, and we boosted the fundamental frequency on the bass. So now I'm going to go back to the kick and make sure that I'm making room for the fundamental frequency on the bass over here. So let's add the visualization for the bass in just to make it really obvious. You can hear them starting to glue together already, right? They're starting to interlock because we have complementary EQ moves enabled there. So now I'm going to add in the rhythm guitar, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the rhythm guitar, and I'm going to focus on the kick first and then the bass. So here's the rhythm. Okay, so we got a high pass here that's cutting all the low end rumble out and giving room to the kick. Let's add that bass in, and let's see if there's somewhere that we can cut to let that bass shine through and boost to make sure that we're not losing the rhythm guitar, just like we just did between the bass and the kick drum. Okay, so right away, I can see that we have some frequency overlap in the 170 hertz range. I think I'm gonna let the bass take that. And with that EQ move right there, I'm starting to hear the rhythm guitar and the bass guitar move as a unit, right? We're starting to get clarity and separation in the low end, and we're getting glue because we're getting these little narrow bands of frequencies out of the way of each other so the instruments can really shine on their own. Okay, so there's some good complementary EQ. Let's just hear what it sounds like all together real quick. All right, starting to get there. I'm going to go back to soloing these three instruments. I'm actually going to go back to just the kick and bass. So that's complementary EQ. The next thing I'm going to focus on is parallel compression. Parallel compression is, sidechain compression rather. Sidechain compression is going to give me the ability to have one instrument apply compression to another instrument when it's active. And I'm going to use the Pro multiband compressor, the Pro MB from FabFilter. This is the famous Andy Sneap trick, although he used the C4 plugin. I like the Pro MB. And I'm putting this Pro MB multiband compressor on the bass guitar. And I'm going to just focus on this range, call it up to 100 hertz. And I'm going to sidechain this to the kick. So what's going to happen now is every time the kick hits, it's going to compress this low end area of the bass. We're still going to get all that grind and those higher frequencies of the bass, but we're not going to have a crowded, muddy low end because when the kick drum hits, it's going to just lightly duck this bass guitar out of the way. So I like to do a pretty fast attack, but I still want that bass transient coming in. I don't want to totally overwhelm it. And I'm going to dial the threshold here until I'm seeing like 1 decibel of gain reduction. So if you've never used this before, you expand this out and click band external to sidechain it. And by selecting the kick drum and the drop down, again, what I'm doing is I'm attaching this frequency spectrum of the bass to the kick drum and compressing it when the kick drum hits. You'll be able to see that visually what that means in a second. You dial it to taste and just look for that moment where they just like glue in. All right, that's great separation. I'm happy with that. Now, let's bring some of our pads in here. So let's start with the sub pad. Let's hear how that's sounding all together. Okay, that's obviously not going to work. So what I'm going to do is pull up my EQ. I really just want this to be like a sub that you feel rather than hear to bring some full low-end heft to the song. Sub bass is great. It's really easy to get wrong, though, and really easy to crowd the low end. So let me just first make sure that I'm just getting the sub that I want. So let's hear it soloed. Sounds like a sub to me. Now, let's do that same exercise. Let's pull the kick in. So the sub, you can see the fundamental frequency of the sub is a bit lower than the fundamental frequency of the kick. So I'm carving some space here for the fundamental frequency of the kick and letting the fundamental frequency of the sub shine through. This is iterative. I'm going to go back into the kick. I'm going to add the sub and see what's going on there. Might want to dip a little bit on the kick to make room for the sub. There we go. Starting to get a thundering low end and getting these things locked together. I'm going to do the same exact multi-band trick on the sub that I just did on the bass guitar, where I'm isolating the frequency spectrum from 0 to 100 hertz, and I'm sidechaining this to the kick. So now the sub and the bass are both going to duck a little bit when the kick hits. So we're getting heft, but we're not getting crowding. Let's go ahead and add this mid pad in. Let me see what's going on with this. Do the same exact thing. Let's add the bass, see what that looks like. All right, so the fundamental frequency of the bass, as we remember, is coming in right around here. So I'm just going to duck this pad out of the way, and I might boost it over here. Don't be afraid to boost in the so-called mud zone. You're cutting it everywhere else, so it's actually okay at times. Okay, and then I did, again, an identical multiband compressor trick. I did bring it up a bit here because I don't want a lot of buildup in between 100 and 160 hertz. So in this other pad, I have it, the band a little bit higher, but the headline here is just, we have complementary EQ moves, making it so all these pieces can fit together across the bass, guitar, the kick drum, the sub pad, and the mid pad. Let's bring the rhythm guitar and bass in now too, make sure that they're all gelling. To my ears, that sounds pretty good. They're starting to fit together and not crowding each other. If you want to create a little extra separation, this is the opportunity to now bring in some saturation. So we did originally complementary EQ, then we did some multiband compression with sidechain. Now we're just going to apply a little bit of saturation. So I'm going to pop this bass into better focus here and a little more separation by applying some saturation to it. I'm going to turn it on while it's playing so you can hear the difference. If you are not getting the separation you want with your rhythm guitar, I kind of am here, so I'm not going to do this, but you can add saturation to the rhythm guitar bus as well. I'll just show you what that sounds like. You can do the same thing with the pad. Saturation in general introduces some higher harmonic frequencies by saturating the signal, and you get more separation that way, and it becomes a little easier to hear the low end. I'm actually happy with how the low end is sounding because, again, it sounds heavy, it sounds thick, but I can still pick out the bass guitar, the bass drum, the rhythm guitar, even the sub pad. They're glued together, but they're not muddy, right? So those are the first three areas of focus. And then the last one is always going to be bus compression. So I have bus compression here on the mix bus. This is the last step, I think, in making sure that you have good low end, because by doing those EQ moves and doing those saturation effects, you're creating separation so you can pick out the instruments. But if you have too much saturation, they start to poke out, right? Or too much separation, they start to poke out. So that's where the mix bus or any kind of bus compression on the drum kit, on the rhythm guitars, et cetera, anywhere you can think of it, that's going to help tuck in things that are otherwise poking out. And if I'm doing it on the mix bus, I'm going to focus on a very low ratio, very slow attack, either 30 milliseconds or 10 automatic release. I'm using the Townhouse plugin, which I like for this, and I'm just going to engage that so we can hear the low. All right, so those are the 4 steps that I like to follow to get good clarity on the low end and make sure you're processing the low end correctly. 1, complementary EQ across the kick, the bass, the rhythm guitars, the pads, anywhere, any instrument that's occupying those lower end frequencies. 2, sidechain compression so that you can have these instruments duck each other out of the way. 3, bus compression. Actually, in this case, we'll say 3 is saturation. Saturation is actually better before bus compression. You saturate the individual tracks and you get more separation so you can hear them clearly. And then finally, bus compression so that you can kind of hear it all glued together. There you have it.